to get started in just a minute or two. I think Carey, we should let people take another minute to get in, don't you?
Right. Let's give them a minute or two here.
Yeah. But welcome everybody to this to our cozy Zoom meeting.
Yeah, thanks for joining. We'll just wait another minute as people are coming in.
It looks like people are starting to filter in, which is great. Again, we're just going to wait a couple minutes here. My name's Asher Price. I'm a reporter at the Austin American-Statesman, and we want to wait until we get a really packed house before we get going here. I'll start here in just a minute.
Yeah, I think we just need 15 or 30 more seconds, Asher.
Yeah. Well, why don't I go ahead and start here? My name's Asher Price. I'm a reporter at the Austin American-Statesman, a longtime writer about energy and environmental issues here in Texas. And last year, I had the pleasure of being a fellow at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas. And one of the really wonderful things about the Energy Institute was the people who populated it, including Dr. Carey King. As many of you may know, Carey performs a range of interdisciplinary research on how energy systems interact within the economy and the environment, as well as how our policy and social systems can make decisions and trade-offs among often competing factors. These are real issues and important questions that that policymakers are grappling with. And one of the things that really struck me about Carey, who is a Longhorn through and through, he did his undergraduate and doctoral work at UT, is that he's somebody who cares about communicating with the public and engaging in issues that matter to people. I mean, where we get our electricity from, how much it costs. These are important questions. And he also was very thoughtful about my own work while I was working at the Energy Institute, and I really appreciated his feedback. So I think the way he approaches his work really speaks to some of the things we're going to talk about today. That is, this new sort of energy dashboard that we'll talk about, as well as if we have some time to talk about it, Carey's new book, which is really an amazing feat, and which is called The Economic Superorganism. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, about kind of competing narratives about energy and the environment. But for now, let's talk about this thing we've all convened to talk about, that we've convened to hear Carey talk about, which is this project he's been working on for quite a while, about this dashboard about our energy future, really. And so, Carey, I wondered if you could just start by telling us what you call this dashboard, who is this dashboard for, what's the intended audience, and then also kind of what prompted it. And by the way, I call it a dashboard, but I guess you could call it a toolkit as well. So I wonder if you could just give us that kind of broad overview of it to begin with.
Right. Thanks, Asher. Your introduction is more than kind, and I appreciated sharing thoughts with you while you were in our office. I'll just state that this tool is really not a product per se of the Energy Institute, people only. It's really a product of the university overall, and several people were involved in this, and you'll see them listed in the documentation on our website, which I'll look at here in a second. But in terms of the goals of this, we call this the Energy Futures Dashboard. It allows users to select some subset of options to set the future energy goals for themselves in the year 2050. But really, the goal of this and some of the other tools we've facilitated at the Energy Institute is to be a convener for discussions, really. That's probably one of the main topics. So facilitate discussions amongst the energy industry itself. Some different people within the electricity or oil and gas sector are certainly experts at more than one topic, but not necessarily everything. This incorporates some different topics put together from transportation to electricity. We hope to engage policymakers and non-governmental organizations that think about energy and the environment. And it can be used by academics as well. Many times academics and certainly consultants in the industry have more complicated tools than what this dashboard is, this online tool. And so it can help them understand some things, but many people know the issues in more detail. But this can still be used to facilitate research for those that are not involved in as much detailed studies and general education of students and the public broadly. So we just hope to provide a tool that can engage questions, engage different audiences. The goal was to make an online tool. Some of this was derived from our previous work that we called the full cost of electricity that engaged over a dozen faculty on campus. And one of the outcomes of that was an online tool to calculate levelized cost of electricity. And because it has colors and buttons, that seemed to attract a lot of attention. So we thought, well, let's try to make another tool that's one step more complicated and it has colors and buttons. So that's what we have. And when you make something online and you want people to engage, it can't necessarily do the same things that an academic tool or a consultant level tool might do, which is maybe run for hours because you're just going to produce one report a year or something like this. It's got to run in less than a minute or minutes. So this facilitated trade-offs. There are simple assumptions that we make. I'll just highlight where I am here, such as how to store electricity from wind and solar. I'll discuss that in detail in a second. There's no demand response once you sort of user chooses some inputs. The electricity demand is fixed every hour of the year. Doesn't change. That's not how the real world will react. And there's nothing specific about exactly where power plants are. We're sort of saying generally they're in these regions of the United States, but where you put power plants matters, and there's lack of detail there. But with that said, we do have good time resolution and some realistic aspects that are important that I'll demonstrate in a second. We have hourly resolution for electricity load and demand and patterns. And so these are calibrated to the year 2016 in terms of a weather year so that they all match with weather patterns and load. But we scale these up to 2050. And we have 13 different regions of the country that a user can select to play with the tool. And that's to facilitate different renewable resource regions and certainly different weather, climate, and load patterns that exist across the country. So that's kind of the highlights of what we're doing and what our general goals were.
Great, thanks for that. And by the way, I should say to the participants, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to throw them in the Q&A, chat section. I can take a look at those as we go on, and we'll definitely also reserve time on the back half for questions from the audience to the extent that people have them. Carey, you used the phrase trade-offs a bunch, and of course there's no such thing as a free lunch, and so I wondered if you could kind of drill down a little bit deeper about how the toolkit tries to examine or illuminate what trade-offs there are, as you recalibrate some of the different variables we're talking about here, and I also want to ask you as a kind of adjacent question is to use another kind of common cliche. Can you ever have your cake and eat it too? I mean, are these inherently trade-offs? Is that one of the lessons of the toolkit, or does the toolkit partly suggest that things might be congruent? That is, in various ways. Can you bring cost of electricity down and tamp down carbon emissions? That kind of thing. So maybe you could anyway tell us a little bit about how this works and what some of the trade-offs are that are involved.
Right. So the tool addresses some trade-offs, not everything, but some of them, and I'll go over these now. So I guess I'll speak for another 15 or 20 minutes here, just kind of going over some details of how to understand the tool. does, and then facilitate questions afterwards. So first of all, you can just access the tool via our website, looking at our policy studies and then energy infrastructure of the future. And there are links to the dashboard. There's also a energy.utexas/calculators, which has the 3 calculators that we have for sort of educational purposes and understanding trade-offs of energy. Once you click on the dashboard, you end up with this website here. So this is the interactive website. I'll just go through quickly how it's used here in 1 or 2 minutes and then show insights that if you were to run the tool many times like we're doing, what kind of insights we might get. So you can select a region of the country. I'm going to go through Texas as an example region, but there's 13 regions. User selects that. On the left side of the tool, the user selects, and I'm just going to give myself the ability to, well, maybe not. The user can select the mix of electricity on the left. So from the major technologies, the percentage of electricity for the year 2050 from these technologies. Second thing the user selects is in the middle on the left is the percentage of light duty vehicles that are driven on electricity versus, say, liquid fuels of petroleum and biofuels. And then the third thing a user selects is the percentage of household heating from natural gas or electricity, which is via heat pumps. And then there's other types of electricity or heat that are such as biomass and petroleum or fuel oil that exist in some regions of the country, and those are approximated as well. The top part of the center column gives information about costs in terms of cents per kilowatt hour and cost per customer per year. That's what I'm going to highlight here as we go forward. The middle part of the column has summaries about the total generation that was assumed for the scenarios, the total amount of power plant capacity of all types that are added up. How much of that, or in addition, how much is from electricity storage in one of the examples. So we have 2 answers here that come up when you calculate the tool. I'm going to highlight what those 2 answers tell you later. And then there's land use as a trade-off as well. How much land would take for these sets of power plants, which is mostly about wind and solar. On the bottom right are a series of time series charts. There's some that we call the dispatch. So this is an approximation of the hourly dispatch of electricity from different technologies. And you can zoom in on all these charts and you can turn the legends on and off if you just want to look at one of the technologies. For example, here's wind. So this is the hourly generation of wind for representative weeks in the spring, summer, and fall, and winter, just to give a feel for that. So this is done for every region. There's 3 charts that show differences in costs, or the costs associated with the scenario. And important here is that the cost here and the CO2 shown is for the entire energy system of that region. So it's not only about electricity, it's the approximate spending on petroleum, natural gas for commercial, residential purposes as well. So I'm going to highlight some costs later. And of course, there's carbon dioxide, which I'll highlight in a second. And again, time series from the year 2000 to the year 2050. So each of these has historical data on costs, CO2, and installed generation capacity to give the user some context of where they're coming from the last 20 years, what's presently been done, and then how their scenario changes that for the future. And so each one of these, again, you can zoom in. So I'm going to go back to the slides and show how we can think about this. So just to highlight, there are 2 kinds of results that come from the tool when you simulate it. And these 2 kinds of results are meant to capture some bounding cases. So there's one result that comes from the tool that we are labeled without storage. And this means that there is no storage of wind or solar electricity in any way. And so in other words, what this means is that if the user selects a high penetration of wind and solar, there are times when you can have more wind and solar generation than the load at that hour. And if this occurs in the user's choices and in the data, then 100% of this excess wind and solar generation is assumed to be curtailed. That is to say, not put onto the electric grid. So that's this without storage case result. Then there's also the with storage case, which is in some sense attempting to be the exact opposite. In this case, there's no curtailment of wind and solar. So any hour that has more wind and solar generation than load at that hour, all of that gets stored and assumed in a battery. For us, we just assume it has a generic characteristic of the lithium-ion battery and costs. So, and if any hour has wind and solar greater than load, 100% of this excess wind and solar generation is stored. and in a battery, and it's discharged at some later hour, sometime in the year, that has lower net load or has low wind and solar generation. So it's not a diurnal, it's not a daily charge and discharging. It's really thinking about the entire year of fluctuations of load and demand. And in reality, something will happen in between. So neither of these are really what will happen. We won't have zero storage, and we won't be probably storing electricity in this way, maybe ever, certainly for a long time. Something will be in between, but this is are attempting bounding cases on what might happen. So I'm going to summarize 3 metrics that are displayed on the tool: the cost of electricity, land use, and carbon dioxide emissions. First is the cost, and this is per residential customer per year. So this is like a cost of service, what somebody on their electric bill might be expected to pay. And I'm going to show a series of these charts here. And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes explaining what this chart is showing you, so that we can easily interpret them going forward. So the first thing that this kind of chart will show is that the colors represent electricity generation technologies represented in the scenario that is run by the user. So if you select some percentage generation from wind and solar and natural gas, 50%, 40%, 20%, this represents the representation of that scenario. And so the generation mix is from 0 to 100% on the left axis. So wind is purple, solar is yellow in this case, natural gas blue, coal gray, and nuclear red. Since we don't have a lot of hydropower in Texas, then that doesn't show up here, but it could show up in other cases. And so what this chart is really showing is showing thousands of individual simulations of the website. So if you push submit on the website, you get one of these little slivers of answers, but we've done this thousands of times, and we've compiled it here in one figure to investigate the trends that are apparent from our tool. So each sliver represents one electricity generation input mix scenario from the user. So for example, this green one would roughly represent a 50% wind scenario, 37% solar, because there's some gas at the bottom, right? So something like 8% generation from gas, 3% from coal, and 2% from nuclear. And so there's a whole range of scenarios that we've ordered here. And so how have we ordered them here to make sense of them? And again, I'll thank Daniel Greer, who's a student working on this, for coming up with this clever figure. So there's thousands of scenarios, and in this case, they're ordered from the highest cost on the left to the lowest cost on the right. So that's the rationale for why they're ordered the way they are. And that ordering is represented by the black line that's going from upper left to lower right on the chart.
Can I interrupt for a second, Carey?
You can ask a question. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, so does this mean that if you cut down your amount of natural gas, coal, and nuclear power essentially and replace it with solar, you're looking at more expensive costs to the customer?
So this is, I'm going to go over that, but this is for the case that's labeled at the top. This is with storage. So this is assuming you store every bit of excess wind and solar, which means you're paying for those batteries. And our assumption of cost for the batteries is making the cost go up. So yeah, I'll highlight that in a second. But the ordering here of the cost, and this is cost per customer per year. And I'll give a context for that here in a second. So every time I'll show a series of these, there'll be this same type of chart for land use, the same type of chart for CO2, and we'll compare the 3 metrics at the end for the trade-off. So just as Asher was kind of asking, okay, what does this mean for the cost? Okay, so there's the scenario on the right, which is assuming you store all excess wind and solar. There's the scenario on the left, which assumes you store none of it. And you can calculate the cost per customer. So they're both the same rationale, but they're the two different results you get from the model. And so the first thing to compare them here, these are the same height, just so we can kind of see the detail, but we can squash the one on the left so that, for example, the $40,000 a customer per year is the same height on the screen, on the Y or the vertical direction, as the height as the one on the right. So here the black lines are comparable, right? If I draw a horizontal line across here, the cost for the black lines is exactly the same. So let's highlight what Asher was sort of asking in his question. So the historical range of spending on electricity for a household, say in Texas, is something like $1,000 to $2,000 a year. So this is the historical kind of amount of money we're spending. So these black lines clearly go above that. And the tool is there to let the user input what they want. It's not telling you what the lowest cost thing is based upon your goals. It's just telling you, letting you select what you want, and then it's calculating an answer. And in that sense, it's educational, and a person has to interpret the answer. So what about these really high cost scenarios when you have the without storage result? So these high costs are driven by really high penetrations of wind and solar in Texas, and they're essentially driven by increasingly large installed capacity. So you got to install so many solar panels to reach this attempted, say, 50% wind and 50% solar type of scenario, that you've just installed so many solar panels to do this. You're getting less and less incremental benefit, and there's just a tremendous amount of capital cost. On the right side, you don't have to install nearly as many power plants, and I'll highlight this in a later slide, but you're substituting this for storage. And our assumed cost for storage here, so I can be clear for this webinar, we took from some analysis at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And most of the data behind this tool are informed by the US government data, some of it from the National Renewable Energy Lab and some of it from the Energy Information Administration. But in 2020, for example, the cost of storage is $300 a kilowatt hour of storage capacity, and declining to $126 in 2050. Now, if you talk to somebody from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, they're going to tell you this is way high than what's already being done. And they might say the current cost is something like half of that. So if you were to divide the cost of storage in half, then the cost could certainly decline to this, but it's still probably not below $10,000 a customer for these sort of most expensive scenarios on the left, for the high wind and solar penetration scenarios on the left. So just to give a perspective of this, I'm going to compare these at the end. If we kind of take a scenario A that's 50% wind and 50% solar, and you store none of it, then this is almost $45,000 a customer per year. So not going to happen. That's not going to be a scenario that comes into fruition. But the tool, just to facilitate discussion, again, the tool doesn't presume that you can't calculate that result. So it just tells you that that result is possible. But on the other hand, if you think, okay, if you relax that a bit and you say, well, I'm just going to have 40% of each and 20% from natural gas, you end up in a range of costs in the scenario B that is comparable to what we're paying today. So this is an example of why someone might say you can get to high penetrations of renewables without investing in storage too much or other types of things on the grid, and you can still have reasonable costs and high decarbonization that we'll look at in a second. So the second one I'm looking at here is land, second out of three metrics, and this is direct land use. So this is what we would call the sort of actual footprint of wind and solar farms on the ground. So it's the pads or the clearing of the land where the wind turbine is actually resting or the solar panel is actually covering the land, including substations, for example. This does not include, for example, space between wind turbines that you could farm in between, things like this. So this is only this direct land use. And so just as before, on the right, we've got some results. Here, they're not ordered from lowest to least, most cost on the left to the least cost on the right. They're ordered from the most land use on the left to the least land use on the right. And this is a million acres on the right hand axis. And we have the without storage results as well. So we have the same ordering from most land on the left to least land on the right. And just like before, the y-axis of the land use shown here is not the same. So if you have storage, if you want to make the black lines on the same scale for both cases, you basically have to shrink down the with storage results to where they almost are negligible compared to the scenario on the right. And that's because the highest land use, if you're going to store all the excess wind and solar, was about 1 million acres. And so if I squash 1 million acres to compare it to the chart on the left, it looks quite small because it goes up to, say, 80 million acres. And so again, the same thing why there was high cost for this without storage result is that gets calculated is because you've installed so many wind and solar farms, mostly due to solar. So this is driven by the desire of the tool just saying, I'm going to meet the hourly capacity, hourly demand at all hours of the year. And for example, our little scenario A that's 50% wind and 50% solar is 81 million acres. It's 48% the land of Texas. So again, sorry, is that going to happen? No, that's not going to happen. That's just a pretty extreme case. But again, the tool just allows you to calculate that so that you can communicate this information about the need for other technologies. And so what this means is if you look at how much capacity actually gets installed, what I'm showing here on the right is a chart that is on the website. So this is one of the time series charts that you can look at on the website. And it's basically saying, okay, this is 17 million megawatts of capacity, mostly solar panels getting installed. Okay, so that's a very large number. If you look at our little scenario B, where we relax this a little bit and say, well, what if I'm okay with 20% gas and 80% renewables? Then I'm 500,000 acres, and I'm 500,000 megawatts. So right now in Texas, there's maybe 150, or let's just say 0.15 million megawatts, or 150,000 megawatts. And this is something like 2 to 3 times that number. So not totally outlandish, and a lower land use and comparable costs from earlier. So that's just an example of the land use. So now we've looked at cost and land use, and now what about carbon dioxide emissions? And what I'm showing you here is carbon dioxide emissions cumulative from 2020 to 2050, because the tool goes to 2050. So we have the same scenarios, the right and the left scenario, the with storage and without storage. And now I've squashed it down again to make the black lines that are indicating the carbon emissions over 30 years comparable on scale, the correct
Can I interrupt for a second, Carey?
Yeah.
Why, as obvious as it is to you, why should it be any different with and without storage for the carbon emissions?
Well, ask me that again after I click this button a few more times and see if I answer your question. So in this case, on the right, if you have storage, essentially if you have over 65% wind, solar, and nuclear, low carbon, zero carbon during operations, you've pretty much decreased the emissions from the electricity sector about as much as you can do. It still goes down from this point I've indicated here by this vertical black line, still decreases, but you're near this, say, 20,000 million tons of carbon dioxide over the course of 30 years. Texas right now is about 700 tons of 700 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. So kind of multiply that times 30, you get pretty much this number. So that's the explanation of the storage on the right. And the storage, in the case on the left, this without storage results kind of has two explanations. If you look at the cheapest, or not the cheapest, sorry, but the lowest cost or the lowest CO2 emissions over the 30-year horizon, this one's driven by really high wind scenarios, right? Wind is going over 70% just because the purple section on that graph is relatively high. And it shows, okay, if you have that much, then you fill this in with, say, 20% more solar PV, and then with just a little bit of natural gas, coal, or nuclear, some other thermal generation, you pretty much decarbonize the grid is about as much as you can do. Again, assuming there's no storage here, right? The tool doesn't allow you to calculate an answer that's infeasible in terms of just timing the generation output. So you'll notice that solar doesn't go to near 75 or 80% here on any of these charts on the left, and that's because you just can't actually physically do it without storage. The left side has a little bit different explanation. So the left side scenarios that are really high carbon here have a different sort of set of scenarios, and these are high penetration solars, so over 40% solar generation, and they're mixed with most wind power, but can be mixed with some other things as well. And so these are, again, driven by large installations of solar to meet this user's desired scenario of, say, over 40% solar. And why would you get high carbon emissions from installing a bunch of solar? Well, the answer is because there's emissions associated with building and installing capacity of power plants in general, and you have to build so many solar farms that it's, concrete, steel, and making silicon, and the energy consumed and the CO2 emissions from making concrete and steel that effectively embody the emissions in the solar farm. So that's example here again. If we have our 50% wind and 50% solar scenario, which is the letter A here again on the chart, the orange section on the right here basically is the emissions embodied from power plant manufacturing and construction. So the other three colors are direct emissions from burning coal, natural gas and petroleum within the economy overall, you're installing so many solar panels that you have a high embodied carbon dioxide emissions within them. And if we look at our little scenario B, which is a relaxed scenario of 20% gas and 80% wind and solar, then you can see that these power plant manufacturing emissions, embodied emissions, are much smaller, largely associated with batteries. Coal goes to zero because we've pretty much taken away all coal generation in Texas. And you have relatively constant but declining carbon dioxide emissions for Texas overall. And again, it's because the other ones are associated with the non-electricity sectors. So this is a summary chart of what we just went over, and will be the end of my slides here. So we looked at land use, which is this first row, millions of acres. Looked at cumulative CO2 over 30 years, which is the second row. And the last row is the cost of service, which is a real dollar cost of service per customer per year. And if you look at, sort of metrics that are not, that are feasible, we can look at each row and say, okay, something like 1 million acres or less, that's less than 1%, or it's 1% or less of all the land in Texas. Maybe something like that is feasible for a wind and solar farm installation. For the cumulative CO2, the three scenarios on the right, with storage, and on the right, and then the scenario B without storage. These are all about the same amount of carbon dioxide emissions over a 30-year time horizon. But the cost of service is the one that kind of sticks out, again, because of our assumptions of a storage cost. And the without storage result with the 20% wind and 80% renewables is a comparable cost to what we're paying today. So this would lend credence to anyone that says, yeah, we can keep installing wind and solar in Texas for a while before we increase costs significantly. This would be some evidence for that. So this middle view scenario could be, is sort of feasible or tolerable on all three of these metrics. And the question on the right ones with storage is just, okay, how much can you get storage costs down? Somebody could argue those, you could divide those by 2, but I'm not sure if you can divide them by 10 yet to get to the costs. So I will stop there, Asher, and you can ask other questions or take them from the audience. Oh, can't hear you, Asher.
Sorry. First of all, it's a super impressive product. I mean, it's something, I encourage people to try for themselves. As you said at the top of it, they can do that through the UT Energy website, or what is it? ut.edu/calculators is the other
energy.utexas.edu and then /calculators.
Yeah. So I encourage people to play around with it. I mean, that's what it's there for. And it's already, obviously you touched on it there at the end, how it has its own lessons, depending on what you want to draw, what lessons you want to draw, but it can confirm or suggest ways you can keep costs down for customers while increasing, wind and solar power. I thought that aside you had about, how much emissions might continue to go up, even as you amp up solar power. That's the kind of thing that if you are from some sector of the fossil fuel industry, you'll kind of latch onto that as well. There are a couple logistical questions that came up with how to use it. The questions from YouTube that I would just like you to address before we get to slightly broader things. One question was, you mentioned there are 13 regions. So this is just a quick question. How are those determined, and do they align with the different NERC reliability entities?
All right. They don't exactly line up with NERC reliability entities. We tried to, I guess, in doing something like this, and again, in the background, we're really integrating data across the entire energy system, not just electricity. So there's no one breakdown that's the easiest. But in terms of practically running a research project, many data are at a state level. So just aggregating states into groups became practically the rationale. And then we sort of tried to aggregate those state groups into NERC-like regions as much as possible. So that was really the trade-off.
Another question that came in through YouTube was, do these cost simulations just look at energy delivered versus energy delivered and energy held for contingency reserve?
Right. So there's not an explicit, I guess, modeling in the background of operating reserves and these kinds of things. So right now, that's not being incorporated. You could add another, 7% or something like this, or 10%. You can try to pick your guess about how many reserves are needed. But right now, that's not in there. So you can think about, a little bit higher. In some sense, that once you get to these sort of really high renewable scenarios, that kind of goes out the wash in terms of understanding that level of detail. But it is important, and we're working on a journal paper, and so that's a good insight that we might include that for the results of that paper and update the tool.
And by the way, again, I want to encourage people you can ask questions through YouTube. You can ask in the Q&A or chat section at the part of the Zoom webinar. And there's one other question that we have here, and then I'll throw a bunch more questions your way. Has anyone done an energy balance on the generation of wind and solar power? Says one attendee. And does this include that it does cost energy and CO2 to make solar panels and windmills? I mean, I guess you addressed that in your talk just now, Carey. But if you want to touch on that briefly one more time.
A little bit, yeah. So I think this person might be asking a little bit more than what I showed. So in terms of how much energy does it cost to make a solar panel or a wind turbine or any other power plant for that matter? So as this person may know, it's one of my favorite topics of sort of net energy or energy return on investment. I put this into context in my book. But we didn't explicitly do that for energy as part of this tool, but we explicitly took into account those types of studies for the CO2 embodied, and as the question implies, some of the carbon dioxide associated with building and installing power plants is because of the burning of fossil fuels during that process, driving a truck or something like this. So that's in there, but not the energy balance. Right.
So I have a few things I wanted to ask you. One was just putting this all together. Was there anything, and then running these different, simulations over and over again, was there anything that surprised you, or did it essentially confirm, you have, compared to the average person, a vast knowledge about these systems? Did it confirm what you already essentially knew?
It confirmed some things that people studying this, I think, tend to say they know or we have high confidence in, which is you could probably get, depending on the region you're in, you can probably get to 70 or 80% wind and solar without changing much on the grid in terms of the overall cost and the maybe or maybe not the reserve requirements. You have a lot more capacity standing by, say, for natural gas. So this kind of confirms that, at least for this Texas example, which is kind of extreme in the sense that there's no hydropower to sort of be part of the renewables mix, as opposed to the Northwest United States, which would have higher hydropower able to contribute to a low carbon mix. So that is kind of confirmed. The cost side, I didn't exactly know how high the cost would go given the sort of assumptions we put in. So that's probably higher than I might have anticipated. But it gives people, so I don't interpret them as saying, hey, this is why you can't do this. You would interpret it as saying, well, given our cost assumptions now, this would probably be infeasible. This is looking 30 years. How can we change it? There's several assumptions behind the tool that I guess it's easy for me to say to interpret the results, and that's a challenge in this kind of a tool. But I would say it's probably confirmed mostly what I thought. But it's challenging to try to explain multiple metrics to people in a way that they can think about them themselves if they haven't thought about them before. So that's I hadn't approached that yet, so we're running through that challenge now.
Perhaps this is an unfair question to ask, but how much confidence should we have in these kinds of projections? I mean, you touched just a second ago on underlying metrics, and I asked this partly, I helped cover politics, and of course we just came through a political season where polling turned out to be bizarro off the walls, right, with a lot of projections. So I know this is like a completely different realm, but I wondered if you could address that for a minute. And partly what I have in mind here is a kind of thought experiment. Obviously, you wouldn't have access to all this data 30 years ago. It would be hard to assemble it. It would be hard to display it in this beautiful way that you and others have worked together to do. But if you had tried 30 years ago in 1990 to imagine the energy makeup in Texas or other places, if you had, landed on the percentages that they are now, would you get the kind of cost or, carbon, output that you do? In other words, as we change the widgets now, looking at 2050, and these scenarios say, okay, well, if you have this percentage of wind and this percent of solar, et cetera, nuclear power, you're going to get these here are some of the trade-offs and outcomes. How much confidence can we have that's what the lay of the land might look like, or that's how those are the kinds of costs that we will in fact be associated with this kind of makeup in 30 years? So it's a bit of a garbled question, but I think you get it.
Right. I guess so. I guess in terms of 1990, aside from me being in high school, I wouldn't have been able to do this, but it would have been hard to have anything reasonable to say, I think, about the costs of, say, including a mix of wind and solar power and batteries. Would have been able to have now. I can't imagine having a very accurate assessment of that in terms of the mix. In terms of the accuracy of this model, it's probably a little bit better than, say, an order of magnitude check. Like, is the number 1, is the number 10, or is it 100 or 1,000? And just, getting the right order of magnitude. It's probably a little bit better than that, but it's not accurate to, say, understand, the difference between 10 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, or even over 30 years, or, the cost of $10 difference on someone's bill. Maybe starting to get to the cost of accurate within the cost of a few $100s a year for a person's bill in future year 2050, something like that. That's really important to a question to ask for something like this, and it's not obvious because the numbers just get displayed how they get displayed, and we try to display them without, I guess, accuracy that we don't claim to understand, but we can probably improve that. People can suggest improvements, certainly. But yeah, anybody's projection it's hard to interpret for a lay person or even experts when they look at someone's, if you read a report and it has some projections out to 2050, and of course Biden's talking about going to zero carbon for the electric grid by 2035. So this doesn't push it to 2035. So that's even faster. So in this sense, this is a relaxed version of what Biden is talking about. The goal is to put the core code open source in the spring as we finalize the sort of journal paper and full documentation. So hopefully for any energy nerds out there, they can run it themselves at a more refined detail. But yeah, understand the assumptions of anyone's projection in terms of, certainly for economic growth. This is what I touch on in my book about the assumptions that are made behind economic growth models. So I do touch on that a lot more in my book, which is, I guess, a longer.
I want to ask you about your book. I'm glad you mentioned that too, because the book, The Economic Superorganism, which I had the pleasure in the fall of last year when I was at the Energy Institute, I had the pleasure of reading bits and pieces of Carey's.
Pleasure of being a guinea pig for me. Yes.
Book. Yeah. Well, it was great. And it's called The Economic Superorganism. It's available at wherever you like to get your books, and it makes a great stocking stuffer. But it seems to me, the book asks important questions about the competing narratives we tell each other about the relationship of energy and economics. And I want to ask you one question about that, and then I'm going to go back to the kind of audience submitted questions here. But in the book, you write about techno-optimism and techno-realism. And in some ways, these concepts form what I think are like the intellectually minded questions that are lurking behind a practical tool like this one that that we're talking about today. So in that sense, these things dovetail. So these terms, techno-realism seems to mean that no matter what kind of energy we use, we're going to have some kinds of uneven social impacts, right? Haves and have-nots globally in terms of pollution and other things. And techno-optimism kind of means, my read on that is that we can innovate our way out of energy problems. I wondered if you could just talk for a moment about these two ideas, techno-optimism and techno-realism, and if it's right to think about these kinds of questions being in the background behind a toolkit like this one.
Right. The tool like the Energy Futures Dashboard probably has a minimal number of assumptions about the economic growth. There is an assumption there. We put costs as a comparison to GDP, but we just said, okay, I just assume GDP grows at 2% a year for no reason other than that's the pattern for the last 10 years or so going forward. So there's that assumption in there. That's just something that has to be made if we want to express costs as a fraction of GDP, which I think is important for understanding feedbacks of the energy system in general. So that's pretty ballparky. But yeah, so techno-realism I see as, in some sense, people paying attention to the physical nature of the world and the economy and the constraints that imposes, both in terms of time, like the time it takes to build stuff. If I want to build a million megawatts of solar panels, and I want to install them in 1 year, that's totally different than if I want to install the same number in 10 years. It's literally time. It's really the rate of change of things is what actually matters. And a lot of the book has these two axes, energy and economic narratives. So energy narratives are fossil energy and renewable energy as these sort of caricature cases. And there's plenty of caricature quotes that one can choose from that I put in the book to demonstrate people with those. But to understand why someone chooses a fossil energy narrative, that's why I got into the economic narratives. And for the most part, I think most things we read are in the techno-optimism narrative combined with either fossils or renewables, right? My technology is going to advance and it's going to do what I need it to do to assess carbon emissions or societal ills to some degree. And the book focus, I'm leaning more towards the techno-realism for sure. And it's because I think that certain social trends and economic trends have been affected by constraints on energy resources, and that economists in general don't focus on that, largely because the normal economic training doesn't include sort of the incorporation of physical principles of energy and how you think about what the economy is and how it operates. So that's my research program. But so I found it basically crucial to say, if you think about the Earth as a finite planet and think about correct timing as well as debt, how do you interpret the differences between money and physical flows of things like energy? How do you actually conceptually think about that? And for the people that do, I think in the research that exists out there, I think they have much better explanations of, say, long-term trends in the economy for the last 60 or 70 years, particularly in the US. My favorite example is wage inequality increasing in the 1970s. And that's exactly when we had a change in energy paradigm with the oil crises and energy consumption per person stopped increasing. So that seems too coincidental to me not to be related. And I focus on that in the book a little bit as well.
Well, I really liked reading it, and it was a beautiful synthesis of a lot of things and brought a lot of learning. And again, it's called The Economic Superorganism. If you're on this webinar, you're obviously interested in these kinds of questions. And in a way, Carey's book goes beyond the bounds of this dashboard. It's about all the rippling effects and all the policy discussions and political discussions that go into these kind of competing, often head kind of butting questions about where we're going to get our energy from. So I want to go take a look here. Some other questions have come in. I'm just going to go down. There's Somebody asked, thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. I think you already mentioned this, but just to confirm, the storage type is battery, is that correct?
Yeah. So we just kind of assume
You said lithium ion battery, right?
A lithium ion battery just for the sake of assuming something, but the characteristics are pretty generic. But one thing that's useful, I'm just going to show here, I have an example of let's just say this 40% wind and solar and 20% scenario. I don't know, are you seeing maybe not seeing the screen yet. There you go. So it quantifies the storage capacity. So this is actually a useful thing in itself, independent of the cost assumption. We just have a round trip efficiency assumption, like, there's 85% of efficiency of storing and discharging the energy, for example. And in this particular case, it says, okay, there's 105,000 megawatts of power capacity in storage, and there's 67 terawatt hours of energy storage capacity. And in this case of the simulation, the Texas total net generation that goes onto the grid is about 630 terawatt hours. So this is saying like something like 10% of annual storage, of annual generation, which is roughly consumption, would need to be stored. And that's not, so that's a useful metric in itself, just to say like, it's really not going to be much larger than that. That's kind of a high-end number. And when you think about other energy systems in North America or the US that store energy, the natural gas distribution network is a great example. We have to store natural gas, or we do store natural gas to mitigate between fluctuation of demand between the winter, which is a high natural gas demand for heating, and the spring and the fall, which is lower because there's not as much electricity generation or heating. And we store about 30% of the annual consumption of natural gas in caverns. And we don't talk about the cost of that storage very much because it's relatively cheap. So the electricity system, in terms of the analysis using this tool, doesn't seem to be that much different. You can have high wind and solar penetrations and stay below 30% annual storage to meet every single hour. So that might be a general
interesting
general trend.
We're gonna go slightly lightning round here, because we're.
Let's go. I'll try to go shorter on the answer. Go.
No, that's fine. The other question this person asked, which I think is an interesting one, is is the analysis only about sort of specific regions? Could you take in the without storage scenario, could you take curtailed energy be sold to the other electricity regions? Is that something contemplated by the?
Right. So one trade-off on the tool to get it to calculate relatively quickly is the simplistic assumptions about how regions would be connected. The only assumption made about how regions would be connected is that wind farms and concentrating solar power could be in neighboring regions and imported into another region. So we made a standard sort of ballpark set of assumptions. Say for California, if they wanted wind power, only 10% of the wind would actually be in California boundary, and 50% might be in the mountain north region, which would be places like Wyoming, and maybe the other 40% in the northwest region. So we sort of inherently made some of these assumptions. In reality, we don't know what the answer is, but we know that the power is going to cross these regional boundaries. And so we've made some reasonable assumptions for that, but it's fixed. And we count for transmission connection that would be associated with connecting those as well. And we inherently calculate the number of miles of transmission, but it's not being displayed on the tool. So that's a good question, and that's really one of the unknowns. Hopefully this tool can at least just start the discussion and facilitate the discussion of what's required.
Yeah, and I think that's a good answer too. That also actually addresses a couple of the other questions that people wrote in here. So somebody wrote, this is you talked about how you have a little hobby thinking about how much it costs to actually build plants and stuff. How long does it generally take to pay for a wind generator, and what is the life of a generator? You have quick.
Well, I think wind turbine, most of the analyses assume something in the order of 25 years. During that time, maybe there's an upgrade on the electronics, the power electronics, maybe not, maybe the generator itself. So I think that's generally lifetime. What does it take to pay for it energy-wise in terms of the previous question? Most of the analyses come up with, well less than 2 years and maybe even less than 1 year in terms of energy, that can get tricky on how you define your little system boundary. So you can email me on longer questions on that. I know papers that treat the whole economy as essentially, yeah, a super organism that extracts energy to maintain itself. And so in that sense, you can't really draw a boundary around one part of it. But the paying for money, that I think somebody else can probably answer that better than myself. It's probably just with the tax credits,
Sure.
probably just a few years. It's going to get harder and harder to pay for them just because they're driving the
I
costs
think
down.
that's
Right?
a good point, by the way. That's a whole other tool. You could have a tool where you factor in tax credits as part of the.
Yeah, you can sort of, if you know what the tax credits
that's
do.
a big variable.
Yeah, if you know what the tax credits do, then you can sort of play around with our levelized cost of electricity calculator and augment the inputs in terms of capital costs or operating costs to try to get a general idea.
Somebody asks, is this solely the energy cost considered for the residential customer, or is the transmission and distribution cost included as well?
Yeah, so it does include transmission and distribution costs. And some of those costs are particular for regions based upon previous work we did analyzing FERC data from their Form 1, which regulated utilities submit their spending and operational cost data annually. So we've used that and sort of calibrated transmission and distribution costs. So they are included in the sense that a residential customer is inherently paying for the transmission and distribution grid in their bill as well.
It occurs to me that we're having this conversation in the interregnum between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Supposedly, I mean, apparently it's still in doubt here in some quarters. But this seems like, to me, as a Texas energy reporter, it seems like an interesting time also about the sort of Texas electricity model. Here is a kind of model potentially for the rest of the country. I know that goes beyond, in a way, the frame of this dashboard, but I didn't know if you wanted to take a second to talk about Washington and the raft of energy issues that they're in, electricity issues that they're thinking about. I mean, the Green New Deal in a way is like one of those scenarios, right? That you're putting into the thing. That's one way of thinking about it, and that may be the scenario where it's going to turn out to be prohibitively cost unfeasible and so on.
So don't let me forget to come to the Green New Deal on cost. At least one comment. So I just since I'm still sharing, I just clicked off all of the costs spending on energy system except transmission and distribution, operating and capital costs, just to show the person asking the question that you can sort of separate those out. But yeah, what's the takeaway from Texas? I guess, I don't know how many people, there is discussion of, sort of the Texas model of how the energy system operates here and how transferable that is. I'm sort of skeptical on how transferable it is. And one of the reasons is because Texas is literally pretty big. It's got a lot of areas with sun, got a lot of areas with wind, it's got a lot of areas with coal and natural gas comes out, and even coal. So, I mean, and we even mine uranium in Texas. So it sort of has all the energy resources, and you don't have to cross political boundaries, at least a state political boundary, to, say, transfer electricity. And ERCOT is somewhat set up so that there is no transfer of electricity within that market to other states. It does happen, but they keep it regulatory the same in terms of not having federal regulations. So that's not really transferable to any of the other states. They don't all have the same quantity of resources within their own state boundary. So they have to work across state lines to do things. And that's when it gets complicated. I mean, if we just drew a line down the middle of Texas and we had West Texas as a state and East or Central Texas, would we have had the competitive renewable energy zone transmission lines that connected, that was a statewide, policy decision made to facilitate wind development in this case. Would it have happened? It could have still happened for sure. Would it have been as easy? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good point. In fact, one of my predecessors is a journalism fellow at the Energy Institute, Russell Gold. His latest book, he's a Wall Street Journal reporter, is about the political problems of getting a kind of transmission mandate.
Right. So that book is essentially, point number one for trying to build transmission lines across state boundaries to connect wind, right? It didn't have to happen in Texas. if you go out of Texas, you got to cross state boundaries. So that's something. I mean, Texas in general, we did a report comparing California and Texas financial support or subsidies. And my conclusion from that was, aside from, I don't really like studying subsidies that much, is that, Texas just seems to have policies that are about doing stuff. If you want to build this thing, here, we'll help you build it. Is it a wind turbine? Sure. Okay, here's a wind turbine. Go build it. You want to drill? Okay, sure, go drill. But just do something. This seems to be the Texas policy.
I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, I think we've sort of run out of time here,
yeah,
right?
I think we're kind of here. So,
what I think we ought to do to wrap things up here is let people know again how they can look at the energy futures dashboard, because I just, it's really a useful thing, and I highly recommend it to the people on this webinar.
Thanks, Asher. Anybody, I mean, you can certainly critique it and add insights we're working on. We have documentation about how it works, the energy futures dashboard documentation. So we've got the nuts and bolts behind it. It's not exciting reading, but for anybody who's willing, you can do that. But just insights into the tool, presenting information, how to phrase things, better ways to present it. We can try to take these things into account. But yeah, we can go ahead.
So I think we answered just about all the questions that came through. Is there anything else we failed to address that you want to address now, Carey?
No. Oh, I think I forgot to mention it again, the Green New Deal question you had. I think one of the big questions there, aside from just how much money it costs to sort of build out infrastructure, is really when it comes down to who pays for it, right? If it's private developers spending money and taking out loans, or if it's the federal government, but these are two fundamentally different ways of quote unquote paying for something. And so the cost implications are completely different. None of that is, discussed in the tool. You could use the tool to sort of talk about the numbers, but then you need something else to talk about if the money comes from the federal government or from private loans and debt. So hopefully this can facilitate discussions like Green New Deal and these kinds of things, but it's certainly not the end-all answer.
Well, thanks a lot for working on this project. Thanks to the other people who worked with you on this project. It's a really impressive calculator.
Yeah, I should have mentioned them. So Josh Rhodes is heavily influential. He's still at UT. Gershon Gulen is no longer at UT, heavily influential. And of course, Daniel Greer is working with me again, a student who's really brilliant. So there was half a dozen other people as well, other students. So thank you.
Congratulations to all of them, and I'm glad you put it out into the world. It should help inform policy discussions, really.
Yeah.
So
we as a team put it in the world, but yes. So thank you for our sponsors.
You
for this. Sponsors of the Energy Institute made it happen. So gift money to produce a tool like this was crucial. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for participating.